Right. So good evening. So those who know me, I'm usually the videographer, but this month we're at the office of the guys who made XSplit. So if you know streaming, Twitch, and all that, that's one of the main software that's used by streamers. Anyway, so since I'm not taking a video this time around, I might as well give a talk. So my talk is about building web developers from scratch. So let's go on to the obligatory. So I'm Bryan Bibat. I'm a senior developer at Alogica. And as always, when there's a talk from some company, there's always the we're recruiting part. So might as well give a talk about that. So as some of you, well, most of us here, we're from Ruby shops or some shops like Elixir shops. There's this problem we have where we can't really find developers. But there's this thing called the Python paradox, where if you hire programmers, developers from non-mainstream languages, you're sure they're good. But the problem is, can you find them? So there's this recruiting problem. So how can you get developers, since Rails, Python, Elixir, and all those non-mainstream languages have very, very high demand, but we can't seem to fill them. So again, companies, we have to do some stuff. We host events and do some community stuff so that we can attract talent. And worst case, we sometimes poach from other companies. So this is a problem. But there's another way to solve this problem, which is training. But unfortunately, when it comes to training, it's not really something that a lot of people talk about, because it's not cool. It's not like the hot new framework. When you talk about training, usually there's only a handful of people really focused on thinking about how to teach Rails, how to teach whatever new language they have. So yeah, we can. So most of the time, we just have to rely on trying to get people from whatever. So how do you train? So of course, you need a plan, because if you're just going to train, usually when you think about training, the default approach should be to just get some, probably some experienced Rails developers, and you don't need to train them. Another way would be to get some interns and shove them into Rails tutorial, and that's enough. But that's usually not enough. So when you do this, when you are planning to recruit and you plan to train, before you build your training course, one thing you have to keep in mind, or at least the first step that you have to take, will be to identify your target. Because you can't just create a training course that's one size fits all. That's the Rails tutorial approach. And I'm going to go into the problems with Rails tutorial later on. But if you want to have an easier time, it's much better to identify your target and you customize your training for that. So what are your possible recruitment targets? What are your possible targets for training? The easiest would be experienced web devs, because say they are coming from .NET, from Java, from PHP, or if you're lucky, they come from other similarly non-mainstream languages like Python. This is the easy one. So if you've hired web devs who are not into Ruby, who haven't been working into Ruby, this is the easy, and it should be easy to craft training course for them. Another possible target would be interns. This is the long game. So you're going to train some interns, hope they graduate, and they come into your company after they graduate. And that works. But again, the way you teach them or the way you train them would be different from the way you train experienced web developers. And this is another possible target. People who aren't really professional developers, who may have dabbled a bit into software development, but haven't really had any professional experience in it. But they're really interested and they're willing to take the effort to study all of this stuff that we need in order to be a productive team member. Okay, so you've identified your targets, and given these targets, you can at least plan how much of developer effort can you give. So of course, we have lots of projects. We can't just assign a junior or even a senior developer. We can't just assign them to spend 50% of their time to train people or 100% just to make sure. So you have to identify your target when you're planning to recruit people who aren't really Rails developers before or developers in your language before. Before I move on, there's another thing to think about when you've identified what you want to hire or what you want to recruit. You have to pre-screen. This is important, especially when it comes to possibly the interns and more especially in the career shifters. They might be interested, but again, you might not have enough resources to allocate in order to properly teach them. So you may have only a couple of junior developers who can mentor them. You can't, it's not really possible to get someone who doesn't really know much about web development because it's going to take a lot of your people, your resources, time. And in the end, it's not going to be that efficient anyway. So you pre-screen them, check if how much HTML, how much basic web development they know, and if you're lucky, you can find someone who has claimed to finish the Rails tutorial on their own. That's good. That's a good opportunity for you, and you can tune your training course for that. Anyway, let's move on. So if you're going to create a training course, a curriculum, there is the Rails tutorial has step-by-step. In my opinion, you have to create a more flexible. It's not really step-by-step, but you have to identify what parts you need to teach. So this is a sample of, it's not really a roadmap. It's just a series of stuff. I didn't even put lines in there, just made them overlap each other so that you know what you need to look for. First, you need what you need to look for in potential recruits and what you need to plan to teach to these people when they pass their interviews. So this is the basic web development that you need, basic web development knowledge that you need in order to be productive. There are other stuff, of course, especially with JavaScript nowadays, and of course with the whole DevOps thing nowadays. But if you just want to be starting out a junior developer, this left-hand side is usually enough. So when you're crafting this, we ourselves are trying to create our own training material, but again, it takes a lot of effort. So I'll just give a couple of samples of links or possible pages where you can get some idea, where you can get info about these topics. So again, before I move that, so let's just give an example. If you're going to train an experienced web dev, you might just need to teach them Ruby and Rails, maybe give them a refresher in software development, how things are done. Say they're coming from a large corporate waterfall type. You may have to teach them how things are done in a less rigid fashion. They already know their DBs, they already know their HTTP. They might need some refresher on Linux, maybe they're Windows developers before, and HTML and CSS, maybe they have some front-end devs, so you need to give them a bit of refresher. So that's one of the ways you can take advantage of this flexible curriculum. Anyway, so let's just make a quick run through of the possible sources. So there's really no single book or source in order to teach these properly. So one example is DB. This is not really fashionable nowadays, but since you're still dealing with data, this is the biggest, I think, stumbling block for a lot of developers because of ORMs, because of, well, basically it's just not that interesting nowadays. But again, you can't escape learning about databases. And in my opinion, this is one of the better sources. So this is the Stanford free online course on databases. So you can just go onto their site, search Stanford. So this is a free online course. It will cover lots of stuff, but again, you have to customize it. There are some lessons here, like relational algebra, that may or may not be applicable to you. But again, this one goes really in depth, such that even though 99% of the time you'll just be using Rails migrations, you'll just be using Active Record, having the knowledge of what goes on behind the scenes about joins, about transactions, and all that will save you a lot of headaches down the line. So next, next would be HTTP. This one is usually glossed over, but if you're teaching interns or people who haven't really worked that deeply, even I've seen some people who are experienced developers 2 years and so on, they don't really know what's happening in HTTP. So if you're from, say, I don't know, PHP, you don't really know what the parameters are, request parameters are, because you can just use the get, you can just get the post, but you don't really know the request and response cycle. So knowing HTTP as a web developer is very important. It's not going to take much time, but at least they have to know what this stuff is about. So like, I don't know, sessions, cookies, and so on. So that's an important thing. Next would be HTML and CSS. There are a lot of sites, but I haven't really found a good site that teaches HTML and CSS properly. The closest I can get would be HTML Dog. Other good sources are usually books, but unfortunately, if you're studying in a book, you can't just copy paste and do those things. So I think the closest I've seen to a good HTML training course would be HTML Dog, and it's not going to take much time to teach that as long as they know the basics, say the box model, the padding, margin, and the blocks. You might go on to the HTML5 stuff like the flex box if you have time, but as long as they can tinker with an HTML, that's usually enough. But again, some developers, even those experienced, maybe they're just used to trial and error. They don't really know what's happening behind the scenes. And next would be JavaScript. HTML Doc has JavaScript, but again, JavaScript is just really hard to teach right now. There's lots of online sources, but I don't know. You can find an online source that still teaches prototype and jQuery, and you've got online sources that teaches really new frameworks that just popped up 3 months ago. So yeah, I think the HTML Dog JavaScript is good enough. Another thing is the Odin project. Odin project is another web development course, and they just rewrote their JavaScript training course. But the problem with the Odin project, it's not that comprehensive, and I'm going to go back into that later. So JavaScript, probably the hardest thing to build in a curriculum, because as a web developer, you can't escape it, and it always changes. Anyway, tools, again, as I mentioned, some of them might not be even familiar with the command line because they've been developing in, I don't know, Windows, or they've been just a front-end developer. Just even if they're using a Mac, they haven't really touched the command line. So learning tools, learning Linux, learning the command line, learning Git, that's important. So again, there's multiple sources where you can learn these stuff. For the command line, this one by Michael Hartle, which is the guy who created the Rails tutorial. There are other stuff, but again, you can't avoid teaching this or having this in your curriculum when you know that your new guy doesn't really have that much experience. Otherwise, they're just going to nag you and say, how do I git commit or whatever. Also, have to learn how to use Linux. If this is more of a, if you have time to do it, you have to teach them how to, well, access a remote server, which is what you can do with a virtual machine. Access it by SSH, learn about public keys and all that, and the deployment process. And they might not have to do it, but again, it's a good thing to know. So again, Git, there's a Git book in the Git website. And this thing also seeps into the software development side, because Git, version control, you have to teach that to your new hire or your new guy or girl, whatever. For Ruby, there are less and less Ruby because it's not the new hotness anymore. But again, it's the opposite problem with JavaScript, which has so many new stuff but gets out of date all the time. Ruby has new stuff, it has less and less tutorials, but they are relatively not out of date because you don't have many language changes. But for Ruby, there's really not a lot of sources. You can get the Pickaxe book. But online, I think the best, in my opinion, is RubyMonk. So this is an online, it's actually pretty difficult to use as opposed to the usual Code Academy type that you're just going to copy paste and enter it in their repo. And this one is a lot more challenging. So it goes up to, as you can see, it includes metaprogramming and so on. So by the time they finish that, they should have at least a bit of the grasp of how things are done in Ruby, as opposed to the language where they come from, or even just how different it is compared to JavaScript. Just another note, I tried to access RubyMonk last night, and their SSL certificate just expired, so I don't know, you can just ignore that and browse dangerously. I think one of the last parts would be how to build your Rails curriculum. If they're experienced web developers, you can just point them to the Rails guides, and that should be more than enough. As long as you give them exercises to cover those stuff. The Rails tutorial by Michael Hartel is the de facto standard, but unfortunately, it's more of a niche. It tries to focus on the really beginner stuff, so it covers all of this DB, HTML, JavaScript, and all that. Even the deployment, as you can see in the first chapter, you're going to deploy to Heroku. It tries to cover all of that, but doesn't really go that deep, and that can be a problem. An alternative to this would be to use the Agile Web Development with Rails book. I haven't gotten the latest version yet, so I can't really comment on that. But personally, I would just write my own. But again, that will take time, but at least you know who your target audience is and how you're going to write that tutorial for them, and what your experiences with new developers or Filipino developers, and how you can translate that into teaching. Then again, some other stuff, learning how to deploy is important. At least they might not be the ones to deploy. Of course, you're not going to give them production access right off the bat after training, but at least they have to know how the process goes. So how you deploy to production, or how you deal with tickets. So they're going to create a code, you pass it for code review. So you got your issue board, your Kanban board, or whatever. You're going to have to teach that. And usually in training courses, that's really pushed until they're going to be deployed. At least you have to introduce this to these topics in your curriculum rather than wait later. Anyway, so that's just the coverage of my talk. If you're going to need to create, or if you're planning to train, I'm going to say it bluntly, it's going to be difficult. It's going to leech resources from you, your senior developers. Some of your senior developers will have to allot their time to teaching. Some of them may have to allot their time to plan accordingly how you're going to build your flexible training course. But in the end, it's going to be, I think, it's a lot better than just the usual hope someone applies to our company, or we're going to hire someone else from another company and hope they're going to come to us. And yeah, we want the local companies to seriously consider training, because that's how we're going to build a community. Not just with Ruby, but also with other languages. Even the mainstream languages need to train, because again, JavaScript. You have to teach lots of new stuff if you're in the web development world. You have to consider training. Okay, so I guess that's my talk. Questions? No questions? No questions. Okay. Eat. For interns, well, interns are a different story. But for this career shifter type, there's a career shifter in the audience right now, our experiment. Uh, it just took around a month and a half. It's more of a the usual training. We can't really do a bootcamp style training. It's going to take a lot of effort. We want to do that. If we get more than one, maybe 4 people, that would be worth the time of a senior developer. But usually, you can cover SQL. If you really want to drill down to SQL, it's going to take a week and a half. HTML, just a couple of days. JavaScript, it depends on if you're going to teach Webpack, ES, whatever. Ruby and Rails is actually more of you're going to give them an exercise. That might take a couple of weeks of back and forth so that they can be comfortable with how you do stuff. And while you're doing that, you will have to introduce the HTTP, the tools, software development. So I guess a month and a half, that should be enough given you've got a good training course. But if if you're getting more experienced web developers, say, again, from other languages, again, there's some other former students in the audience, I guess you can do that in probably a week or 2, as long as you have a good training course. You have some exercises that you know that could really push your new developers to learn these stuff. Okay? Other questions? Former student. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I want to create my own training course. If I have the time, I'm going to have to create my own Rails, because of course, in your company, you might have to deal with legacy code, and if you go to guides.rubyonrails.org, it's now been Rails routes, but when you run it on Rails 4.2, it's been rake routes. So that's one of the advantages of having your own training course. You can point out that, hey, we have some projects that are still using 4.2. This is how it's done before, and this is how it's done now. And some of them, like how the difference between sprockets and whether you're going to use Webpack, you have to make an effort to really consider those things. You can't just make a one-size-fits-all, because you have to, again, consider those obsolete stuff. And when they search their problem, it shows up in Stack Overflow, but turns out the Stack Overflow problem, the solution is only for 3 point something. And, again, that's something you have to keep in mind. And again, you might have to go my way and just build your own training course and customize it based on your experience. Okay, no more questions. Thank you.